Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. If you're having any technical issues, please type them into the questions box. And now I'd like to introduce Diane Ronaldo. Welcome.
Good morning from Annapolis, Maryland. My name is Diane Ronaldo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Open RAN Policy Coalition. I'm so pleased that you can join us as we discuss the release of our Open RAN Policy Roadmap, a pathway to accelerate international Open RAN deployments. When I have the opportunity to speak with people such as yourselves, I've been focusing on the what. What is Open RAN? How can we ensure a more robust and diverse supply chain if we're able to standardize the interfaces between the subcomponent parts? But today is a momentous occasion in our short history. Today is the first time that we are able to shift our focus from the education to the how. How do we make Open RAN possible? The document we are unveiling today is a result of countless meetings, internally within the coalition and externally with policymakers such as yourself. The document that we will shortly unveil will help answer the how and start a discussion on where do we start. Our 57 member companies that span the mobile ecosystem and the globe have developed this document to best guide policymakers towards initiatives that can help spur investment and deployment. It is the result of coordination and collaboration, and that is so very important to this conversation today and as we move forward. The International Policy Roadmap is intended as a starting point for a discussion between stakeholders. It outlines policy tools applicable to addressing a number of regulatory objectives, including strategies for governments to support the emergence of new network infrastructure vendors in their integration into global marketplace for Open RAN solutions. It will catalyze investment for technical capabilities. It supports operators as they develop an approach to managing a multi-layer network architecture. It accelerates demand for Open RAN solutions, establish the right approach to oversight of multi-vendor network architecture, and engage with international allies to share experiences regarding how to promote supplier diversity in the RAN. I am so honored today to be with you to have this conversation, and I look forward to hearing what our panelists have to say. If I could ask Claudia Selly from AT&T to please join me. Claudia is going to be moderating our panel today. Claudia, are you able to?
Yes, thank you very much, Diane, and I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay.
Now, Claudia,
Perfect.
you could quite possibly have the longest title I have ever seen. Could you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the work that you're doing at AT&T?
Of course. Thank you very much. So I'm Claudia Selli. I'm the Executive Director of European Political and Legislative Affairs. I'm based in Brussels. And so the main part of my work is really to follow the legislative process here in Brussels of the different policies that are passed and tabled here. So I'm really delighted to be with you today. You know, I'm very honored to be able to moderate that very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, great. We appreciate you doing it for us. And I would ask the other panelists to please join. And Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's discussion. And as I was saying, I'm really honored to be able to moderate that session that will focus really around policies that government can take at international level in order to enable the faster adoption of the Open RAN network and basically also create and promote a network ecosystem that is diverse, competitive, and secure. And in order to tackle those issues, I have with me two very distinguished and high-level speakers that I will introduce shortly. So on the left hand of my screen, I have Eiji Makiguchi, who's the Director General of the Global Strategy Bureau in the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication, the government of Japan. And Mr. Makaguchi, you have been at the ministry since 2001 in different and various roles, including International Policy Division, the Global ICT Strategy Bureau. So thank you very much for joining. And on the right-hand side of my screen, I have Scott Bailey, that is the head of the Telecom Diversification Unit at the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport from the UK government. You have a very interesting title, Scott, which is pertinent to our discussion today. You have been at the ministry since 2016, also in various and different roles. In particular, you have been head of the mobile 5G spectrum policy. You have been the principal and private secretary to the Secretary of State, and before joining that ministry, you also have been working in the cabinet office as well as in the Department for Communities and Local Government. With that, I would like actually to kick off the discussion and to ask you to give a brief introductory remark before we move into a more moderated Q&A session. Maybe Mr. Makaguchi, if I can turn to you for some introductory remarks, and then I will move to Scott. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, moderator. And good evening, everybody from Tokyo. Thank you very much for having me as a panelist in this important webinar for promotion of Open RAN. My name is Makiguchi Eiji, Director General of the Global Strategy Bureau, Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications of Japan. Promotion of Open RAN is an important policy topic for the government of Japan, and I appreciate to have this opportunity to introduce the policies of Japan. I also look forward to hearing the policies of the United Kingdom and also the thoughts of the private sectors from Open RAN Policy Coalition. The Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, or MIC, holds the jurisdiction of the telecommunication industry and is in charge of regulation and industry promotion policy. We promote Open RAN considering the benefit in structuring and operating mobile networks. We also support Japanese vendors to expand overseas businesses. Japanese mobile network operators are one of the early adopters of Open RAN, while existing mobile operators such as NTT Docomo are beginning introducing Open RAN equipment into their networks. A new operator, Rakuten, who launched their services this year, is building a completely new network using the Open RAN. We believe that Open RAN would contribute to network flexibility, enhancement of security, and competition among vendors. MIC is implementing promotion measures for Open RAN, such as tax incentives and support for R&D. We are also active in international cooperation and coordination. In addition, MIC is initiating far-sighted policies towards the next generation of the mobile network that would be realized in 2030s. In the Beyond 5G promotion strategy that MIC released this June, ensuring openness is stipulated as one of the important efforts in the big picture. We will continue to secure openness of the 5G and Beyond 5G networks with medium and long-term vision and strategy. As a part of the strategy, we are establishing the Beyond 5G New Business Strategy Center, in which we will support the activities by private sector to standardize and promote openness and virtualization toward Beyond 5G. We will also launch Beyond 5G Promotion Consortium this month, in which we will enhance cooperation among business, academia, and government, and we will enhance international cooperation to promote Beyond 5G. And next year, we are also planning to hold a Beyond 5G International Conference, in which we would discuss the policies and activities regarding Beyond 5G and would strengthen international cooperation further. So these are the brief outline of the policies we are implementing in Japan. I'm happy to hear the activities in other countries and to answer questions if you have any. Thank you very much. I return the microphone to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your introduction. And Scott, I will leave the floor to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, and also delighted to be here. It's a very sunny but chilly day here in London, so but delighted to be joined by colleagues from all over the world. It's actually excellent timing for me that we are doing this webinar today, because I'm very pleased that we actually published yesterday, and I have it in front of me, the UK government's 5G supply chain diversification. And I thought I would just use my introductory remarks just to set out a bit more about the key elements of our strategy, which hopefully we'll be able to get into in a bit more detail in the subsequent discussion. So our thinking and the strategy is really based around three core strands of work. The first is the steps that we want to take to support the incumbents. Many of you on the webinar will be aware of the context that we're doing this work in the UK, where our government has taken decisions over the past 12 months in relation to the future availability of high-risk vendors in the UK's network. And as a result of those decisions, we're left with only 2 vendors supplying into the UK market. And so clearly a really important strand of our strategy for the time being is ensuring that both of those vendors can continue to supply into the UK, but also I think that we can work with them to think about what R&D they can do here in the UK and how we might be able to align our long-term roadmap and our vision with their thinking. The second strand is around attracting new vendors to the UK. We've had lots of really positive discussions with our ministers and officials, with lots of companies about their interest in coming to the UK, and the strategy sets out the steps that we're interested in taking to make the UK a more attractive market for companies to come to. We talk in the strategy about potentially the use of commercial incentives, but also other barriers that we might be able to take down that relate to policy and regulation in the UK, and perhaps I can talk about those in a bit more detail. And then finally, and perhaps of most interest for this session, the third strand of our strategy is around accelerating the development and deployment of open and interoperable technologies, which, like our colleagues in Japan, we're very enthusiastic about. And whilst, as I've said, I think we want to take a balanced approach, including kind of protecting the incumbents for the time being, we are very enthusiastic, and we see that the long-term vision for the network is around openness and interoperability as default. We want to see disaggregation of global supply chains. We want to see security and resilience becoming the norms in the network. And we want to look at how we can distribute global componentry around further from the kind of from the way that it's concentrated at the moment. So I'm also really pleased that the strategy is being backed up by an initial £250 million of investment from the UK government, which is to help us deliver the initial elements of the strategy. And I guess the kind of key elements, and perhaps we can talk about this in a bit more detail, are we want to establish a national telecoms lab in the UK. We want to look at what we can do around spectrum. So we've heard from vendors and operators the potential benefits from defragmented spectrum. We also are interested in looking at what we can do to follow the example that other countries have taken to sunset legacy networks, so 2G and 3G. We're interested in taking forward a broad program of research and development, including test beds, building on the activity that's already happening in the UK. And we want to look to see what we can do with other partners around international standards. So I guess in terms of our next steps and why it's so great to be here, we are very aware that the UK is only around 2% of the global market, and therefore, if we're to be successful in delivering the vision that I think others share, we need to do that in collaboration with others. And likewise, I suppose the strategy is sort of just the beginning of the end, and we're very keen to continue the really productive industry engagement, including with members of this forum that we've had about what we can do both in the UK and internationally to promote the long-term vision as we see it. But I'll leave it there, and then perhaps we can pick up some of those points in discussion.
Absolutely, and thank you very much. Yeah, both of you, in fact, laid down already very interesting points. So if you allow me, I wanted to start with one question, as both of you highlighted the fact that you presented some policies around vendor diversification and promotion of Open RAN. Certainly you already hinted at some of those aspects, but what are the benefits that you see in the Open RAN adoption, if you can dig it a bit more, and why should be excited by that potential? If maybe, I don't know if Mr. Makaguchi, you would like to start
Yes.
with some thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you. In the existing mobile network, since devices by a specific vendor were installed, there was a so-called vendor lock-in situation where it is difficult to change to different vendors' devices. However, promotion of Open RAN enables network operators to structure a network with devices from multiple vendors. As a result, Open RAN stimulates the competition among vendors and leads to a lower network structuring cost, supply stability, and ensuring the security. The 5G network will be utilized not only as a calling and network routing tool, but will be utilized in a variety of situations in the society through, for example, smart city. Furthermore, beyond 5G would be the key infrastructure of the society. That is why we are promoting openness in the 5G and beyond 5G networks. Thank you.
Shall I pick up from there?
Absolutely, please.
I mean, I think that was put very well, and there's probably little I could really add. I think we share the analysis that, in a sense, sort of irregardless of the recent decisions that we have taken in the UK, actually, perhaps over the last 15 to 20 years, the story of the mobile market has been one of consolidation, and that has probably that has had a sort of number of policy consequences, and some of those we are looking to address through our diversification strategy. And I think kind of the primary lens through which we see the possibilities of open and interoperable technologies, of which, of course, Open RAN is a leading contender, is around the possibility of boosting the resilience and security of the UK's infrastructure. So the resilience across our networks and within our networks. But I think, as others have said, we also see the possibility in terms of giving more flexibility to network operators in terms of how they manage the network. I think there's a good argument that it should reduce switching costs. It will enable, obviously, disaggregation between hardware and software, which brings with it that flexibility. And we hope, I think, that will lead to innovation, a more healthy market, which obviously will have knock-on benefits for consumers in terms of reduced costs. So I think Open RAN is really the cornerstone for us of a sort of vibrant, competitive, innovative market in international telecoms.
Thank you. And maybe my follow-up question would be whether you can describe to us the way your policies will accelerate the growth in the vendor ecosystem and the adoption of Open RAN, and maybe what are the challenges that you are confronted with and that you are tackling, with your policies. I don't know in which order you would like to start. I don't know if Mr. Makaguchi would like to go first.
Yes. I would happy to. As I mentioned earlier, the government of Japan developed tax incentives this year for the deployment of 5G. Corporate tax is deducted for carriers who install 5G facilities that are certified to meet some requirements, one of which is openness. We regard that the openness requirement could be met by adopting the interface specification designated by ORAN Alliance. It is also stipulated in our Beyond 5G strategy that in the future, MIC would examine applications to government-funded R&D projects and application for the radio frequency allocation from the telecommunication operators if they are utilizing the open standard. And also to facilitate development of open architecture 5G RAN, efficient multi-vendor interoperability testing environment is important. In this regard, MIC has launched an R&D project to save time and cost on O-RAN interoperability testing with private sector. In parallel with this R&D project, MIC encourages the establishment of the Open Test and Integration Center, or OTIC Japan, by operators and vendors. Thank you.
Scott, if you would like to jump in that
Yeah,
discussion.
of course. So I think, again, I think there's a huge amount of overlap, which is great to see with between our thinking. And as I mentioned, we have just announced £250 million to spend in delivering our strategy in the UK. And I imagine that a decent proportion of that will be spent on research and development. So perhaps if I talk a bit about the challenges as we see them, maybe that would be helpful. I think, I mean, the first thing is, it goes without saying that Open RAN is still somewhat of a nascent technology in terms of its development, and that's why we really want to promote research and development, not just in the UK, but kind of collaboration across the globe between academia, between industry, and regulators and government. So I think the first challenge is kind of how can we accelerate Open RAN such that operators can feel comfortable to deploy it at scale in their networks as quickly as possible. I think the second challenge that we need to overcome is around sort of being confident about the security of Open RAN and other open and interoperable technologies. So I mentioned that in the UK, one of our plans for early investment is a national telecoms lab. One of the kind of key roles as we see it for that lab is, I think, is to again to assure ourselves and to develop our understanding of the security of Open RAN and how it can be deployed in the UK. And then I think probably the final sort of set of challenges are around the kind of barriers that all new vendors will face in coming into new markets, and I mentioned some of them. So around defragmented spectrum, around sort of brownfield sites, and the fact that certainly in the UK we've got operators who are running 2G, 3G and 4G networks, and there's also some regulatory barriers around quality of service and things. And I think again, we are interested in looking at how we can help to reduce and minimize those barriers as much as possible, to make it as easy as possible for new vendors to come in, new vendors with Open RAN to come into the UK market.
Thank you. Those are very interesting, sets of issues that you are highlighting here. And my next question would be, in your policies, without being able probably to summarize them thoroughly, but it seems to me that the Japanese, type of policy has been focusing particular in stimulating the demand for the Open RAN, while the UK has been more focused on the supply side, such as investment and R&D. You also mentioned the fact that you are putting forward funding, to enable and to help the supply chain. if this is a fair characterization of your policies, could you please also highlight why you decided to focus on that area particularly, respectively? And so I would give the floor first to our Japanese representative and then to our UK. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, frankly speaking, it is not, it may be not a fair characterization of our policy, because as I already mentioned, that the government of Japan implements not only tax incentives for demand side, but also support for the supply side R&D and launch of the OTIC Japan, as I mentioned. We take it important to approach both sides, both supply and demand sides, and we would like to take various policy approaches. Thank you.
And Scott, over to you.
I think we're in danger of violently agreeing throughout this session, but I think we would probably also say that we have a slightly more nuanced approach than sort of simply to focus on one side or the other. Although I can see where you've kind of got that from. So on the supply side, certainly I've talked a fair bit already about what we want to do to encourage R&D in the UK, how we can reduce barriers. I think we're really pleased that we've kind of started with some really quick initial projects. So we announced alongside the strategy yesterday that we would be funding a project with NEC, which we're very excited about, and they're basing their new 5G Centre of Excellence in the UK, which I think is their first in Europe. And we're also funding a project that's a joint project between what we call the Digital Catapult and our regulator here in the UK, which is called SONIC, a brilliant acronym, which is going to look at how we can bring together operators and new vendors to test and trial new kits. So I certainly think we are doing quite a lot on the supply side, but actually the strategy certainly says that we'll explore commercial incentives, and I think we leave all options on the table really to kind of to stimulate demand as much as kind of promote supply. I think where we do come from this is that we are sort of relatively technology agnostic. We want to deliver the long-term vision in terms of openness and interoperability and a more healthy and competitive market, and we see Open RAN as a really promising kind of way to get there. But I think we ultimately want to stimulate an environment where we can kind of bring together vendors and operators to test all sorts of new technologies, and for us the kind of the sort of vision or the win, as it were, is to deliver that end goal. So the kind of means is to get to the end.
Thank you. And I think both of you, throughout your answers and speeches, you have been highlighting the importance of international collaboration. In fact, the Open RAN solutions is certainly global, addressing questions and challenges like the vendor concentration or ensuring network security. You cannot do that by yourself, but you need also others. So what are you doing in concrete terms to coordinate with international partners and industry and stakeholders? Can you highlight a bit more that aspect?
Thank you. In Japan, both mobile network operators and vendors are promoting network openness, and Japanese government is also supporting it. But we believe that openness cannot be achieved through the efforts by a single country. Therefore, we would like to cooperate with governments and private sectors internationally. Mobile network operators and vendors in Japan are participating in the international activities of O-RAN Alliance. The government of Japan is supporting their efforts by subsidizing their experimental projects for technical standardization of the O-RAN and vRAN. In addition, we would like to continue to send messages regarding the importance of openness through bilateral policy dialogues and international fora such as OECD and APEC.
Again, I think a risk of violent agreement, but I mean, you characterized it really well, Claudia, and I said it in my opening remarks. You know, the UK is around 2% of the global market, and we're talking about fundamentally reshaping much of the market, and we can't do that without aligning and coordinating as much as possible with like-minded countries. I'm really pleased that in the development of our strategy, to date, we've already had some really positive conversations, including with colleagues in Tokyo the week before last, which was a really positive conversation. And similarly, we are having lots of bilateral engagement, both our ministers and officials with countries who are in a similar position to the UK and are thinking about similar things. And I think we are sort of similarly open to multilateral coordination and engagement. Still probably a bit early to say exactly where we see that happening, but I think we do see the benefit of doing kind of multilateral engagement as well. And I think ultimately we're kind of keen to move as quickly as possible to some tangible things that countries can do together. I agree that sending a clear signal of policy intent is a really important signal, I think, and the more countries can sort of say that, you know, the more we can send the market a signal that that's the way that we want to kind of see the market moving. But we also then, I think, need to find some specific areas, whether that be R&D or standards or other things like that, where we can actually kind of coordinate activity together, and that's sort of what we'll be looking to do next.
Thanks, and you already certainly hinted to that during the discussion, but if you can give an advice to governments in how they can help really, you know, basically advance that priorities, what should they be doing and what should they not be doing in this respect? Mr. Magakuchi, if you would like to kick off, and then.
Yes, I would. It seems that Japan's vendors, for example, NEC and Fujitsu, would like to contribute to promote the openness domestically and internationally based on their high technology and competitiveness. We think that efforts to acquire market share both domestically and internationally should be based on private sector's own activities because they get benefits directly. MIC aims to make Japanese 5G services and products open, secure, high quality, and flexibly responsive to various demands. We also expect that they contribute to improve 5G network globally through promoting Open RAN and vendor diversification. Thank you.
It's me again. So I think probably what we shouldn't do, and I've mentioned it before, is assume that we can do this alone. And I'm not going to repeat what I said before, but probably the biggest mistake I think we could do is to assume that sort of countries acting alone can solve this problem. That said, I think you know, certainly in the UK we are interested in looking at ways in which we can enhance and develop UK capability. You know, one of the reasons why we're having really productive conversations is we are interested in talking to vendors about coming here and testing things and trialing things and basing themselves in the UK. And I think again, there's a sort of question for countries as we take this forward about how best we can coordinate that so that we can work out, you know, how do we divide this up so that we can get to the best result as quickly as possible. But I echo the comments about also needing to be led by industry here, and you know, we have a really productive relationship with all of our operators in the UK and with vendors, and I think they are ultimately the answer to this. We can just sort of help to facilitate that as they go along.
Thank you so much. One last question for you is that certainly, you know, a more diverse ecosystem of vendors and multi-layered network architecture is new as well for many regulators. What are the principles in your view that should guide the regulator as they seek to provide oversight for an open, interoperable network architecture? do you have any advice on that?
Okay, let me start again. We think that diversification of vendors brings many influences and it's our favorable direction. That is because the diversification enables various entities to participate in the market and it contributes to ensure the transparent and fair market competition. In the meantime, since the capability and function of the mobile network operators would play more important role in the network operation, responsibility of the regulatory agencies would become more vital in the future. In addition, international cooperation and harmonization become even more important. Therefore, we think construction of the framework for governments to cooperate and mutually learn each other's best practices would be even more essential. Thank you.
Thanks.
I will start where you left off, which is to agree around the importance of international cooperation, including on regulatory alignment. Here in the UK, we have a very fiercely and in a good way independent regulator in Ofcom, who are rightly sort of independent of government, but of course are thinking about what role they can play in the UK and internationally as we sort of take this work forward. I think it's probably fair to say that in general, we haven't sort of had or regulated for resilience, and we've probably kind of not quite accommodated resilience in our network infrastructure in the past. And there's clearly kind of some thinking that I'm sure Ofcom are doing about how we can do that. And again, I mentioned earlier, some of the policy and regulatory barriers that we're thinking about, we are looking at how we can address jointly with Ofcom. So they have a really important role in the UK about management of spectrum. They have some responsibilities in relation to quality of service, which will be relevant to our thinking as we look to sunset 2G, 3G. And as I said, I think it's still quite early days in terms of the sort of role of the regulator, but we are kind of working with them where that is possible to take this forward in the UK.
Thank you so much, and for all your thoughts and for those insights. I think we are coming to a close of our session, where I noted various issues that both of you addressed, from tax incentives to the importance of managing frequencies and spectrum, support to the incumbent, support of R&D, international cooperation, which is really critical. It seems to be one of the most important aspects that you highlighted, and the regulatory alignment in a way, as well as industry lead, and you help facilitating. I think we have Alex probably joining the panel to continue the conversation.
Yes, hi Claudia.
Hi Alex. I will leave the floor to you, and I wanted to warmly thank our participants and speakers.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here.
So yeah, thank you so much to AG and to Scott for that discussion. It was, as always, pretty incredibly instructive and obviously very timely as well, with the Japanese government's launch of their initiatives a couple of months ago, and in particular with the UK government launching their diversification strategy yesterday. I'll start off by apologising. For some reason, my webcam seems to be struggling a little bit, but may have to we may have to live without that unless I can get it going there. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So my name's Alex Botting, and I am Director of International Programs with the Open RAN Policy Coalition. And I'm going to walk you through a document that we've pulled together over the past month or two, which is our Open RAN Policy Roadmap. Can we move to the next slide? So a bit of background on the coalition, and I'm sure Diane ran through parts of this at the beginning of the conversation, but it's been quite a whirlwind 6 months for our organization, which was formed in May of this year. And we're now up to 56 members from 11 countries. And that group spans operators, it spans vendors, both those that have been in the market for decades and those who are much newer to the game. And our objective as a group is to promote policies that accelerate the adoption of open interoperable solutions in the RAN. Ultimately, this is where the market is headed, but it is a question of how quickly we're headed down that pathway. Next slide, please. So over the past 3 months or so, we've been increasingly engaged internationally. We've had bilateral engagements with 23 countries around the world. And in addition to multilateral institutions like the OECD, where I was earlier this morning talking about this particular topic, it's clear from that the discussions that we have had, there is a huge interest in Open RAN. I'd say there's a pretty strong understanding that this is where the market is headed, and governments are trying to grapple with both what is the significance from a technological perspective, but also what should they be thinking about as we make this technological transition. Next slide, please. So some common themes that we've pulled out from those discussions with governments. The first is across almost every government, I believe every government we've spoken to, there's a desire to see greater vendor diversity in the markets. The second, many see an opportunity here in terms of helping to facilitate the emergence of competitive companies domestically who can compete on a regional or global level. Natural inclination as we see a transition over to a different paradigm within the market. The third is a desire to avoid dominance of companies from any single country, and that's no particular countries, but as a general rule, I think governments have expressed a desire to see companies emerge from a number of different countries with a number of different capabilities, and it is that which will enrich the Open RAN ecosystem. The fourth is in the age of COVID, which we're all too familiar with at this point, the digital divide has come into stark focus in many, if not most, countries around the world. Homeschooling, work from home, events like this all require internet access, and in many parts of the world, as we're all aware, internet access either is not in place or is not of a particularly high quality, and the flexibility of Open RAN architectures and how they're constructed from a technological perspective does offer opportunities to expand digital access, and for many governments that is quite an exciting prospect indeed. Final question is, what should we as governments be doing? And if we can move to the next slide, this is the purpose of the Open RAN policy roadmap. It's our high-level answer to that question, and it's intended as a starting point for discussions among stakeholders, government, industry, consumers, and so on. It is not intended to answer the question on behalf of every government. There are intricacies to each country. Part of the reason we're engaging bilaterally with governments is to help tie the roadmap to the intricacies of those countries. But at very least, it is a good starting point for thinking through what governments can do to help accelerate adoption. There are 3 components to the roadmap. The first is what we refer to as tools. These are policies that could be implemented by any government. It's really the range of policy options available as we see it. Objectives is our attempt to frame either the challenges that governments may be seeking to address, the opportunities that they see out there, but framing it in the context of how a policymaker might look at the topic. And finally, there are case studies within the document. These are examples of policies that have already been put in place by governments around the world. It is an area which we will no doubt have to add to as the months roll by. We are already outdated with the drop of the UK government's diversification strategy yesterday. That's something that almost certainly we will incorporate some best practices into the document. But it's our attempt to look across the landscape of what governments are doing, pull out best practices and share those across governments around the world. Next slide, please. So if we look at the tools, we've pulled together a handy, what I hope is a handy infographic on the first page, which attempts to distill what is quite a wide range of policy levers into a single snapshot. We've broken these out by color coding and the little icons, which will come up in the next slide. We have 3 buckets here: fiscal, regulatory, and convening. Within the fiscal piece, this is stimulating the supply side or the demand side of the market. So on the supply side, we look at things like government-funded research and development, tax incentives for industry to conduct research and development, bridge financing for small businesses, which, as we well know, it's one of the most challenging times for small businesses is in the time to get their product to market. So enabling them to survive during that period should ensure that we have more small and medium-sized vendors that make it to market. On the demand side of things, there is examples such as the Japanese government providing tax incentives for private sector procurement. Also, there is government procurement and existing mechanisms such as foreign aid, development financing, and so on. And obviously, those two go back and forth between one another. The stimulating demand, particularly through private sector investment, is a great way to stimulate supply because you're growing the overall market. So those two shouldn't be viewed entirely in isolation from one another. Within the regulatory bucket, I'd say these 2 columns neatly break out into the domestic and international piece of things. On the domestic side, we're looking at reviewing and replacing outdated regulations, facilitating timely 5G and Open RAN deployments, because again, those things help to stimulate demand. They help to bring forward or shorten the curve of technological adoption. Also, avoiding mandating standards or technology use, which ultimately creates challenges further down the road as standards are updated, different technologies are adopted, and we don't want to box ourselves in through putting mandates in place. In the international domain, looking to work with international partners on topics like the harmonization of spectrum bands and developing a common approach to security risk mitigation. Ultimately, this is going to be a truly global market, and we want to make sure that steps that are taken by one government are in sync with steps taken by others. And then finally, as we frequently mention, one of the greatest powers of government is the ability to convene. And this breaks out into policy and technical. On the technical side of things, it is about addressing some of the technological challenges, in enabling particularly SMEs to prove out their technology in pilots and test beds, helping to bring together minds from industry and academia to work on specific technical challenges, and in particular information sharing with allies to ensure that our activities around the world dovetail and don't duplicate. On the policy development side of things, it's about both engaging across different groups of stakeholders and engaging across borders to ensure that we are aligned and governments are aware of challenges being faced by industry and helping to address those. Next slide, please. So those are the range of tools. What we do next, and really what takes up most of the roadmap itself is tying those tools to specific regulatory objectives. And what we've done is pulled 10 example objectives which have come up in conversation with our governments over the past few months, and tied those tools to specific objectives. So in the top right, for instance, the emergence of new network infrastructure vendors. If you're wanting to stimulate the emergence of domestic companies that can compete in the international arena, here are some examples of policy tools that you can utilize that will help you to achieve that goal. It's not intended to be exhaustive. Governments may well be creative in ways that we couldn't necessarily foresee and add to this list of policy tools. That's great if so. But certainly it should give a starting point on the kind of steps that governments can take to achieve each goal. Bottom right, establishing the right approach to to oversight of a multi-vendor network architecture. We're going to see a shift here from single vendor network architectures to ones in which multiple vendors can be incorporated, and from a policymaker's perspective, particularly for regulatory bodies, that is can be viewed as additional complexity, and we've got some recommendations here for how policymakers can get comfortable with the way that architectures are being constructed. And next slide, please. So finally, case studies, and we've pulled up an example here from the government of Japan. We've tied this back, you'll see in the center there, to the specific area that it's seeking to address, in this case, stimulating demand under the fiscal bucket. And we've got an explainer there on specifically what the Japanese government put in place to help stimulate demand. As I say, this is an area where we have a couple of examples in the document at the moment. We could already add one or two more to them, and we'll continue to do that to ensure that we're grounding the policy tools in reality, but also taking best practices from around the world and ensuring that governments can learn from what their peers are doing elsewhere. So that's a quick overview of the document. I believe we either have or will be circulating that for attendees today. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Alex, we haven't received any questions specific to the roadmap, but one question that came in a little earlier that you may be able to address from Michael Kendi, can you please explain in a bit more detail how Open RAN increases resilience and security?
Yes, so there are a number of different components there. I think the one that is top of mind for the governments that we've spoken to is the vendor diversity piece of things. It ultimately comes down to choice amongst operators. By having greater options available in terms of how you construct the network, that gives you the opportunity to both standard risk mitigation measures, identify risks, and ensure that as you are constructing out your network, you're taking those into account and mitigating them and having greater flexibility to do that. Secondly is the having sort of a choke point in which one or two or a smaller group of vendors could, were there to be an incident with them, would have more widespread effect if they have a larger chunk of market share between them. Where that is more diffuse and you have multiple vendors in the network, naturally the impact of an incident to a single vendor is reduced. We could go into more details on that, but from a high level, those are a couple that we'd flag. Any other questions, Alison?
Alison, you're muted.
Hello?
Sorry about that. For Alex, how does Open RAN address digital divide in a COVID era? That's from Michael Bergman.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's not something that intuitively your mind jumps from Open RAN to COVID and the digital divide. There's a couple of components. One is the cost factor. In the short term, in some instances, but I would say across the board in the medium term, there's a view that the OPEX and CAPEX costs associated with Open RAN deployments are going to be lower, or certainly can be lower, depending on your choice of vendors in the network. And that can act as a bit of a tipping point where rural areas may not be commercially viable to date because of the lack of population density or because of local incomes or whatever it might be. In many cases, we can see the lower cost of infrastructure deployment and maintenance serving as a tipping point that makes it commercially viable to provide access. Example of this in Peru is Internet para Todos, which is using an Open RAN architecture to expand access in rural areas of Peru. A second component is more to do with the technology. Because Open RAN gives you flexibility, I should say the combination of Open RAN and network virtualization give you the flexibility to construct networks differently depending upon the infrastructure realities of a particular area. You can place the DU nearer to the edge or further from the edge to account for those realities. And so from a technological perspective, it gives you more flexibility to meet the realities on the ground. So just because something wasn't, a particular area wasn't ripe for digital access in the past, doesn't mean that it need be the case going forward when we have that additional flexibility in terms of construction of the architecture. Any other questions, Alison? If not, I see we're coming up towards the top of the hour.
Sure, last question if you want to take one more quick one. This is from Joseph Stevens. He says, how soon could we see 5G Open RAN deployment? I understand most deployments are in 3G, 4G.
Yeah, I think that depends on a number of factors, including the sort of rural versus suburban and urban. It depends on if we're talking greenfield and brownfield, but I believe we already have some 5G Open RAN deployments. So I believe I'm right in saying Rakuten either has recently or is about to launch a 5G Open RAN network. We're already, we've seen announcements from Vodafone in that regard. So we're starting to see it in terms of widespread 5G Open RAN deployments. I think that somewhat depends upon the conversation we're having here. What do governments do to accelerate the adoption there? So I wouldn't want to put a specific time frame on it, but we are already seeing some deployments. We will continue to see those ramp up in the coming months and years. And in terms of where we see it hit critical mass, not necessarily for me to say at this point in time. And with that, thank you everybody for joining. And I want to put out one last thanks to our speakers on the panel earlier, AG and Scott and Claudia Sally for moderating. And thank you all for joining the discussion today.